Hi, I wanted to make another video then, further to the video I made yesterday, talking a bit about Chomsky and Epstein and Chomsky's email to Epstein where he was trying to soften the blow with the media reporting regards abuse of women. And I was basically saying that Chomsky, was in a position of quite a lot of power due to his reputation. And I guess if I wanted to crystallise one point from that video, the point would be to say that when you're in such a position, the choices that you make in your life reverberate out a lot further than they would if you weren't famous. And if you're in a leadership position, a revered leadership position, then you've got a duty of care to make excellent choices. You're not always going to get it right because you're human, of course you are. But what you do and who you support really does matter. So you have to do a lot of homework. You have to make sure that you're supporting the right people. In some cases, it might be an easy association. In other cases, there could be a few red flags. And if there are any red flags, you have a duty of care that goes beyond just simply liking someone or warming to someone. And in this video as well, I'm going to touch upon sort of darkness and predatory types of people as well. Now, I'm not a psychologist. For further work on that, I'd suggest one great starting point would be Dr. Karen Mitchell on X, who is doing PhD data or has done a PhD. Either she's doing it or she's completed it, but she has conducted an awful lot of work into dark personality types, namely sociopaths, psychopaths, and narcissists. And what she does, she tends to group them all together into one larger group, which she calls persistent predatory personalities, PPP. That's her word for it. And of course, they have their own distinct groups as well. And of course, they can be broken down into further subtypes as well. But she finds that there are so many similarities between all three groups that she can easily put them together under one larger umbrella, which she does. And so her work seems to be very, very interesting in that regard. She's a really good place to start as well, if you're interested in finding out a bit more. But I tend to imagine that whilst anyone can make an easy mistake, when you're a bit further up the ladder, you can't be too knee-jerk reactionary in your response. Part of the problem with persistent predatory personalities is they can be charming in some cases. If you're dealing with a full-blown psychopath or a narcissist, for example, sometimes they can come across as very charming, but they're highly manipulative, highly duplicitous, highly cunning. And so it would have been in Epstein's best interest then to try to insinuate himself in every little nook and cranny around the globe with every influential person that he jolly well could. And he seemed to have succeeded. He seemed to have done quite a lot of work in that regard. And of course, there are some people who seem to be right up there with him in terms of their own predatory, horrific behaviour and the levels of abuse that they themselves conducted, which puts them in either the same category as him or a very, very similar category. And all of those people need holding to the highest account. And you wouldn't perhaps look at Noam Chomsky in that way. It seems he had a friendship with him. At the moment, it doesn't appear that there's data to suggest that it was a lot darker than that friendship. But what troubles me is that in his email to Epstein, he's seeking to ameliorate, to soften the blow as to how the media are treating Epstein. He thinks it's terrible, the media's treatment of Epstein. And you have to ask the question, well, why was he so trusting with regards to Epstein? Why would a man who was a brilliant man, some would say a genius, fantastic analytical mind, why would he so easily succumb to the charms of Jeffrey Epstein? One reason could be that level of duplicity that these people can present as perfectly normal in some regards and as very likeable sometimes as well. So there's that. And that perhaps can add as a slight caveat. However, even with that in mind, you have to remember that Chomsky was aware, he should have been aware, he should have apprised himself of what was going on with Epstein before he made a snap decision to support him. And he should have been aware because of that duty of care, not just to himself, but to a much, much vaster community. If you're in a position of power and you support the wrong people, you help to prop up a really sick architecture in this regard. You have to get it right. You have to be as careful as possible, in other words. And it would seem that for one reason and another, he either wasn't careful or he perhaps himself held some views that might have been questionable. And I wouldn't, as I say, at this juncture, necessarily imagine that he's on the same level in any way as Epstein. But did he hold some level of misogyny? Well, maybe, when Epstein is talking about the way the press is treating him, Chomsky is responding, talking about the hysteria regarding the abuse of women. So he's talking about the hysteria of abuse, in which case it sounds like he's acknowledging there is abuse, and then he seems to be admonishing the response to that, which he sees as hysteria. And so these things are important to bear in mind. I can't draw any absolutes at this stage, but I find it only right that anybody with any association with Epstein is called into account. And due to the gravity, the heinousness, the hideousness of Epstein's crimes, that they're called into the highest account, And that includes Noam Chomsky. So it's possible perhaps to think, well, maybe there was a level of duplicity there. Maybe there was a level of which Noam thought that he was an upstanding character. But as soon as those words leave your mouth, there's the realization that Chomsky wasn't just a naive little flower in all of this. There were press reports. He chose to ignore them. He chose to downplay those reports and imagine they were of relatively low import. And just to reiterate on the timeline of this again, as far as I'm aware, the crimes of Epstein were perhaps first noted, or he was first charged, I believe, in 2006. 2008, there was the plea deal with 2 victims, and he had to register as a sex offender because of the abuse of minors, I believe. In 2011, that, I believe, is when we first started to hear a bit about Virginia Giuffre. He maintained a bit of a friendship with Epstein right up until Epstein's death, pretty much. Now, Epstein passed in 2019. He reached out to, I think he did anyway. He was certainly, that was when he was arrested in 2019. And he reached out to Chomsky just before his arrest. And in November 2018, we'd seen we'd seen Epstein's crimes serialized in the Miami Herald, for example, thinking of a US publication, in great detail, but also various newspapers were blowing up around this and talking about Virginia Giuffre, talking about other elements of this, talking about Epstein, etc. So we know he was apprised of this media coverage to some degree because he talks about the hysteria of the response. So what then is important is his response to this, how he chooses to respond. And he's chosen to respond by calling it hysteria and trying to comfort Epstein by telling Epstein to ignore the media coverage. And so that does raise questions. It does raise questions about Chomsky. And some people want to think that perhaps Chomsky was just an older gentleman at that point. He'd lost his mind a little, perhaps. I would imagine he still had hold of his faculties at that time, because it wasn't until 2023 that Chomsky himself suffered a huge stroke. So it's a sort of salutary lesson as well, that we all of us have a duty of care to think about who we hang about with, who are we friends with, you know? And especially if you're in an esteemed position. It matters anyway. It matters from a moral and an ethical perspective. But if you're in an esteemed position, you're in any kind of leadership position, you have to be squeaky clean as much as you can. You have to consider your position when befriending somebody and when choosing to continue a friendship, even when the sharks are circling, the reports are growing, rather than seeking to simply dismiss it as hysteria. You owe it to your, I wouldn't say fan base, but you owe it to all of the people who've looked up to you, you know. Noam Chomsky has contributed to society in such a big way, such a fundamental way, with politics, linguistics, philosophy, and himself standing against sort of oppressive regimes or critiquing them and standing for or standing against exploitation. But here he is, absolutely standing with the worst kind of predator in a shocking loss of judgment, you know. And so you do have to ask questions, and it's only fair and right to ask questions. And my conclusions so far, you know, nothing's set in stone here, but my conclusions so far are that Chomsky himself had a kind of misogyny. He had that attitude sort of hardwired into him, maybe to a degree he wasn't even aware of, you know, to actually want to downplay it and talk about the hysteria rather than consider, well, do these crimes sound plausible? In which case he could have made a different choice. And if he'd have stood up at that point and publicly renounced a friendship, say, with Epstein, that would have helped support victims who at the time were still being disbelieved by the general public. So he had a part to play, and he could have chosen differently. And had he done so, he could have had a bit of a positive impact. As it is, you know, it's not a good footnote to anyone's career seeking to sort of mollycoddle or seeking to play down the crimes of the most horrific sex predator. And of course, at the time, he wouldn't have known the full extent of who Epstein was. But as I say, there was so much press coverage that himself he was well aware of, that he could have made different choices and thought, well, you know what? This is a good time to walk away from this friendship, you know, and say this isn't ethically or morally right anymore. So there's that. And it's important and it matters because it's people like Chomsky who themselves were so esteemed, highly esteemed, that if they have association with someone like Epstein, then it makes Epstein seem more socially acceptable to others and so on and so forth. If someone's that embedded into culture in high places, then everybody who has a role to play, who thought he was their mate, you know, they themselves have to have a level of accountability and culpability with regards enabling, whether witting or unwittingly, you know. So there's that. So no, Chomsky doesn't come away looking good from this, in my opinion. Not at all. Not at all. And that's going to potentially tank his reputation completely. But you have to argue, because of the level of the crimes, that's kind of right that it should do that. You know, the nature of this depravity, the nature of what Epstein has done. And of course, this isn't just about Epstein, and there are many others, high-level people. We should start seeing a massive distancing of and a massive bringing to account and a massive, we should start seeing people being sacked left, right and centre, people really speaking out in very strong ways and people being arrested as well. We need to start seeing a lot of that. In the UK as well as the US, yes, we've started the ball rolling in the UK, but it isn't good enough. Keir Starmer needs to go, just absolutely needs to fall on his sword. There is no question there, you know, due to Peter Mandelson and so on. I believe the royal family themselves cannot cry that they didn't know about this on any level. They would have been apprised. Somebody would have apprised them, you know. It cannot come to them as a complete shock, especially when Andrew himself was taking a couple of these women back to the palace, etc., allegedly. But again, we have to be able to ask questions. People want their heroes to stay heroes. At this point, I don't think anyone gets that privilege. You know, it doesn't matter if you're an alleged royal family member or not. I say alleged. I mean, it doesn't matter if you were a formerly esteemed royal family member or not. You know, you still need holding to account. And I don't think Charles gets to absolutely walk out of this scot-free either, or William, or any of the other royals. You know, they were well aware that something was amiss with Andrew for a long time. And it's only all now coming to light because of, you know, because of Virginia Giuffre, who was very brave in speaking out. And then because of Epstein. Otherwise, you know, would we have even seen Andrew demoted at all? These absolute horrific people that can exist in very high places. And so a quick note then about predatory personality types as well. Predatory personalities, persistent predatory personalities. These people can sometimes be incredibly duplicitous. You know, I don't think that Chomsky and others get to cry that they just didn't know that they were duped necessarily, because these are very clever people in high places. They would have met the odd psychopath, sociopath or narcissist. They should have had some basic grounding in psychology to that degree. Just enough to know that if somebody's overtly charming, that might just be a little bit of a red flag potentially. in some cases, but especially if that's coupled with an awful lot of media coverage talking about really horrendous crimes, you know. But these people exist and they're out there. And there's quite a lot of them, you know, thousands and thousands of people in the world who fall into one of these three categories. And they can be devastating at worst, the effects of what they do. Because these people have low to no emotional empathy, in the case of psychopaths, etc., there won't be any emotional empathy at all. But there is this high level of sort of predatory behaviour. There is this high sort of level, this high need for control and coercive control and cruelty, because they don't have a conscience. They don't have the usual mechanisms which drive you and me. Part of the reason they get away with it for so long is because perhaps we need to be a little bit more apprised of these people. And it can be psychologically difficult to apprise yourself of something so alien to you, you know? When you think about what they're like, remove a conscience, and then they can go anywhere and they can do anything. They're bound by nothing, not even the law. If you're that high up, you know, not necessarily. So when you think about the behaviour of other people, you tend to frame it in what you know in your mind. And so you're going to come back down to your behaviour, how you would behave, what's the most likely, what's the most probable. And because there's no way you do these insane things, it's easy to write it off as insanity or conspiracy theory and think, well, that's so insane, no one would do that. But what you're doing is you're thinking that's so insane and horrific, you wouldn't do that. But if you take a conscience out of the arena, a high desire for cruelty, for hedonism, for just pure evil in some instances, and then you remove the brakes on what would make anybody do these things, and that's your own empathy, that's your heart, that's your soul, that's your conscience, the things that drive you, that mean you have your own morals, your own ethics, your own conscience. You have a line that you wouldn't cross, your own levels of integrity. These people have none of that, you know? And because they can also be quite charming in some regards, it can make them harder to spot. And because they can be very cunning, they will go to extraordinary lengths to get away with whatever it is they want to get away with. In some cases, blaming the victim for behaviours they themselves are doing. That can be quite common, I believe, with narcissists, for instance. So I think it's in everyone's best interest to have that little bit of schooling with regard to dark personality types. Being on the receiving end of a dark personality type, having to deal with one in a difficult way, being a victim of one of these people it can be devastating. It can be devastating because they can pull out all the stops to ensure they destroy a person in all manner of ways, you know, whether physically abusive or mentally abusive, hence terms like gaslighting and things like this. And if you think that there's anyone in your life who is like that, please do seek help as well, because it can be so mentally exhausting because of the gaslighting, because they can tell you, no, you're the one imagining things, but your own conscience is screaming at you, your own gut feelings are screaming at you, no, you're not going mad, you're not imagining things. There's something going on here, you know. So there are many different ways in which we've sort of unwittingly, collectively propped up a very sick society. And one of the ways is that perhaps predators can come across as quite plausible and quite likeable in some cases and dupe people. So there is that. There's the inherent sickness in society anyway, which I touched upon yesterday as well. You know, society is kind of created from corruption in many respects. And we have all the wrong values collectively. We think it's a dog-eat-dog world, you know. We trot out sayings like this without really thinking too much about it. It doesn't have to be. And I don't think it can be if we're to go forward in a meaningful way, you know. We can't be divorced from our hearts and our souls in this life. It really matters who you are, the integrity that you hold, who you are as a human. That's all that we take with us when we die. We don't take our riches, we don't take our status, we don't take job titles, but we take that. We take the collection of who we've been, our actions, our thoughts in the world. And so it's really important that we hold on to that integrity in a world where, you know, it's systematically collapsed integrity in so many ways. Everything has become so distorted for so long, you know. And so as a response to all of this darkness, all of these shocking revelations, I would say one response is be in your heart. Be heart-centered, especially if you've cut the world off a little bit, cut off your ability to feel what's going on in the world. And you might think you need to do that in order to survive. But have a little look at your actions. If you're becoming a bit cruel, a bit callous, that's not the way forward, you know. We are housed in these bodies for a reason. We're not robots. We're not here to divorce ourselves from our hearts. The heart field is so much stronger than the measurable field from our minds, say, which is about, you know, if you can measure these things, and apparently some scientists can, they say that the field, the measurable field from the heart, it extends to about 3 feet outside the body, I think, roughly. The brain, you're talking maybe about an inch, perhaps less, maybe a centimetre. You know, there is so much power in love. Now, I believe, my own personal belief, which is also born from a spiritual experience I had, is that we are eternal beings having a human experience. That we exist in this sort of sea of consciousness of which we're a part. We're this individual little sparks of something much greater, this loving consciousness. And it's just love, pure love, this loving intelligence. And we can connect to that by going within, by becoming more heart-centered and going within. We've been enslaved as a species, really, because we've been divorced from our hearts and we've been divorced from our spiritual origins. But this hasn't made us better as a species. The more divorced we are from these things, the crueler and harder and more depraved society has become. I think, you know, Epstein is sort of teaching us all that. It's very, very hard to read about some of these crimes, but I believe we have a sort of duty of care to apprise ourselves on some level as to what's going on, because collectively we can't change what we refuse to acknowledge, what we refuse to look at. We can't carry on practicing cognitive dissonance, telling ourselves all is well in society when it so blatantly isn't, you know. And we all of us have a duty of care to participate in a loving, meaningful, kind way. We can all do that. That's, you know, it's very easy to look at crimes like this and numb out, or to fall into apathy and think, well, my God, this world is mad, it's horrific, there's nothing I can do. But that is not the right response. It's not a good response. You might feel like that for a day or two, but then you have to come back, because there is something we can all do, even if it's just how we respond to our friends, family, co-workers, sign the odd petition, be a decent human in the world. That's our legacy. you know, and the ripple effect of that in the spiritual field is probably far greater than any of us will ever know. The personal decisions we make, however tiny, matter. The integrity that you hold within matters. Being that in the world means that you're a tiny little light. And the more of us that do that, the more that light spreads. And then we can make the changes we need to make, because we do need to make changes, you know. Many people think at this point that nothing less than total societal collapse is called for so that we can start again, rebuild amidst the rubble. And I don't think it's such a bad idea. There's so much corruption still being hung on to now, you know, even with all of this going on, because the network that held up Epstein, of which he was a part, still exists. He was just a public face of something that has been happening in society for a long time. And it's worth bearing that in mind too. We need to look at it. We need inquiries. We need arrests. You know, people need to go into prison for very long times. But then we need to also look at psychology, become apprised of, so that when victims speak out, we don't simply go, well, that sounds like a conspiracy theory because it's so wild. It might sound like that, but we need to then examine further, not just walk away at that juncture and go, well, that just sounds too insane. We can acknowledge it sounds insane, but then we have to do a little bit of further digging and acknowledge that some of the most wild seeming conspiracies can actually be rooted in truth, you know, can actually have a lot of sort of bearing in our society in ways that we don't really want to acknowledge, because a lot of it is so unsavoury. So how we respond matters, and who got involved matters, and that includes Noam Chomsky, you know. He had a choice. Did he want to dismiss the newspaper reports, think that they were mere conspiracy, hysteria, nothing to see here, because Epstein seemed like such a nice bloke? Or did he want to have a little think, step back for a second, consider his position, consider who looks up to him, consider that if these victims' testimonies are true, that is that not horrific? And then if that was his friend, could he not help these victims by speaking out? You know? And he chose not to do that. And there are going to be many other people, I'm sure, that get unearthed in the fullness of time, that we start looking at in a very different light. And it reminds us that even people who are seemingly brilliant in society are fallible too. That the shadow side of the human psyche, as Carl Jung termed it, is within all of us. It's within these predators, the Epsteins of this world, to a very great degree, because, as I say, they have literally no conscience. But we all of us have a shadow side. We all of us have a shadow side. And so we have to interrogate ourselves. We have to hold ourselves accountable. And we have to do so with great compassion, great care. But one of the ways that we do that is by simply bringing a little self-awareness to bear into our own lives. Learning more about ourselves and who we are, you know. I think it was Plato who said, know thyself. And it's a very powerful start in this life, because the more you know about yourself, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, the more you can make positive changes. You know, we're none of us perfect. All of us have some problems. All of us have some issues. All of us have our own difficulties, our own unique place in this world. And you're just as worthy as anyone else. Your difficulties don't make you lesser than anyone else. But you must know them to some degree. You must bring that light gently to bear on your own life, on who you are in life. Because then you get to be a better person. Then you get to act in a better way. And you're not always going to get it right. Sometimes you're going to fall over. Sometimes you're going to make a dodgy assessment of things. But the trick is to do better next time, to learn from it as much as you can, you know. So we all of us need to have a little think about our own part we're playing in this life, especially now, all the more so, you know, given all of this darkness, and who you want to be. Do you want to stand for the light? And if so, how much? And just being kinder, more decent, more honest, having a high level of integrity, all of that matters. All of it makes a difference. All of it is really worthy, you know, and being able to do that, even when the world around you is crumbling and becoming so very dark, well, even better then, because then you can then be a bit of a light for people around you as well. These are going to be tumultuous times. Some spiritual bods have been warning us for a very long time that times were going to get darker, things were going to get worse before they got better, that there really is an opportunity for change here, and potentially very positive spiritual change. But that's kind of on us as a collective, and to some degree on us individually as well. We can't change what's outside us, but we can change how we respond to the world, and we can change who we are in the world, and whether or not we're a force for good or not, you know. And all of that is so, so important. All of that matters. So I'll leave it there for now. These are difficult times. You might see the odd hero that you loved toppling off a pedestal. But it's just that reminder not to hero worship anyone. We can recognise people's achievements, and they can rightly be applauded for achievements in the world. But then when they fall over, when they are fallible, if they are terribly so, we must be able to call it. We must be able to see it. We must be able to draw a line. You know, we can't hero worship. We can't automatically assume because someone is very big or very powerful in the world, or because they have a great body of work, that they are therefore unimpeachable, that they are therefore above any other scrutiny. Because no, that is not the case. That is not the case. And that's kind of part of the reason. It plays a role in how we sort of got where we are, I believe, to some degree, you know. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Take care, God bless, and have a good weekend. Bye.